Well, welcome everybody to this month's Conan Fitness Platinum webinar. We're going through basic training guidelines. Basically, we're going to break tonight into three kind of parts. The first part being a point of simplicity. Just to put everything in perspective, we'll be talking about the different types of training or categories of training. As you know, there's plenty of different types of training out there, heaps of different training modes and modalities. We're going to try and dull it down just to a few, just for the point of simplicity. The second part will then be delving into a little bit more complexity, so going into a bit deeper understanding for the point of understanding, and these main for these main two reasons. The first is going into the facets or the parameters of fitness. Some people call it the components of fitness. And that's like, why do we do the training? What are all the individual benefits of it from the body's perspective? And then looking at the physiological adaptations to each of those types of training. So what physiological adaptations happen within the body for us to get better or more proficient, for instance, at that facet of fitness. And then finally we'll wrap it up by kind of putting everything together again, building it back up to a level of simplicity for the purpose of application. So some sort of practical guides or guidelines to put all this kind of theory into practice. So I mentioned the three types of training. As I mentioned, there are plenty of different types out there. I like to nut it down just for simplicity to these three types. Firstly, weights training or resistance training. So anything with kind of weights or resistance. What are the benefits of this style of training? Well, typically, when we're, your typical weights, what we're trying to do is, if you think of metabolism, for instance, it's kind of like turning a little four-cylinder engine into a V8. So if you imagine a little four-cylinder car that, doesn't do much, doesn't chew through much petrol, compare that to a big juiced-up V8 that really guzzles the fuel, but has a bit more of a muscle engine. You also see there it says increased muscle mass, or LBM, that stands for lean body mass. Lean body mass is one of the best predictors of basal metabolic rate, BMR. So if we can improve our lean body mass, not only we have that healthy, strong, lean body, but we also have our V8 metabolism. EPOC and DOMS. EPOC stands for excess post-exercise oxygen consumption. Bit of a wanky term, but basically what it means is the excess oxygen consumption post-exercise that you're consuming above and beyond your normal metabolism. So throughout the day you're always burning oxygen, and that means you're burning fuel, you're burning fat and other substrates, but we're burning calories basically. When we do exercise or an exercise bout, as you know, our caloric expenditure, what we call here our oxygen consumption, goes up because obviously it's a higher intensity than just sitting on a chair, for instance. But since that intensity is so high, when we stop the training, that doesn't necessarily just drop straight back to your immediate basal levels. It has a tapering off effect. If you can imagine, like a graph, and the graph goes up quite high for the high peak of intensity of that exercise bout, and once the exercise finishes, the cessation of that training bout, then imagine this area under the graph, or the area under the curve, as it slowly tapers off and slowly comes back down to basal resting levels over time. The area under that curve, above and beyond your normal basal metabolism, is what we call EPOC. And the more pronounced the shift in intensity is, as in the higher the intensity, the longer and more pronounced that EPOC is. So we're burning more calories after training. DOMS, that's your delayed onset of muscle soreness, and everyone knows that. You get sore after a good bout of weights, or any form of training really, and that does produce a prolonged metabolic disturbance. That does cost the body a bit of energy. So while it might not feel so great when you're sore, it does actually burn a few more calories. Then there's our usual benefits to to weights and resistance training, like strength and toning, as most people know. That takes us to easy cardio. Now, the term easy cardio is a little bit it might get you off track a bit. Think of it as from the point of steady state. I use the term easy cardio just for simplicity. I think so. Easy cardio and hard cardio doesn't necessarily mean it's easy. It's just typically easier. It's more aerobic. It's at slightly lower intensities, but you can have a decent intensity in easy cardio provided it's steady state. So if you think of something like going for a run or going for a bike ride. Great, so then we've got our easy cardio. And the term easy cardio might be a little bit misgiving in that the better term for it's probably steady state cardio. What we mean by steady state cardio is something that is just the same sort of steady heart rate throughout the majority of the session, and it's typically longer duration. So you see there easy cardio, hard cardio. Easy doesn't necessarily mean it's easy, because it can be quite challenging. It just means that it is steady state and therefore more aerobic base. We spoke before about turning a 4-cylinder engine into a V8. Well, this is kind of like taking the V8 for laps around the block, just for calorie expenditure. There's the cardiovascular effects of this style of training, as we know, and lipid substrate metabolism. So at the lower intensities, a greater proportion of the calories are coming from fat. Now note that term, proportion. So fat's used predominantly, which is a good thing if we're doing, the longer duration. And typically it's 75% heart rate max or less, somewhere around that zone or lower. Hard cardio, therefore, or interval training, that's more anaerobic base of cardiovascular training. So that's where you get your hard, easy, hard, easy. So someone's working at an intensity that is too hard to maintain for the whole session. As in, if you can maintain that intensity, that would be a steady state intensity. So no matter how hard it is or how hard it seems, if you can maintain it, it's steady state. And that would class as easy cardio. So hard cardio presupposes we're working at an intensity that we cannot maintain for longer than the time period you're aiming for. Sometimes several minutes, sometimes only a couple of seconds. So really depends on the mode of training. But here are the benefits of hard cardio. Firstly, it improves the body's ability to utilise oxygen. Now, oxygen utilisation we're going to be speaking about quite a bit soon, and therefore fat burning. The myth of the fat burning zone. Just before I mentioned about the lipid substrate metabolism, saying that at lower intensities, a greater proportion of fat, a greater proportion of the calories burned comes from fat, as opposed to other substrates like carbohydrates and protein, etc. Well, I highlight that term proportion because if you were to think about it, really what we want to talk about is absolute quantity of fat burning. For instance, if I were to say we're going to burn 100 calories in an exercise bout and 80% of those calories came from fat, that means if 80% of the 100 calories, that means 80 calories were burned from fat. But if I were to say, okay, we're going to do a nice, tough, intense session and we burn 200 calories, but only 60% came from fat, someone says, see, the higher intensity, the lower percentage of fat. Yes, but 60% of 200 is still more than 80% of 100. So we're talking absolute values here. If time is a concern, this should be the main cardio training. So when time's a problem, hard cardio is a great way to go because you can still get so many of the easy cardio benefits and even some more with such a short time period. So it's really good from that perspective. There are health benefits above and beyond those of easy cardio, and there's a larger epoch than easy cardio. So as we mentioned before about that excess post-exercise oxygen consumption, that area under the curve, after training, because of the higher intensity, that's more prolonged. As we mentioned, epoch's kind of related to intensity. So there's our three types of training. Now let's get into the parameters of fitness, or what some people call the components of fitness. You see there the four basic components of fitness. These are the four that most people talk about when we're talking fitness, and we call them the S's. we just for simplicity, we start them all with an S. The first four are strength, speed, stamina, and suppleness. So with strength, think about a truck. A truck is this big, strong, powerful machine that could pull a house, but it can't necessarily move very fast. Then we go to speed. Think of a Ferrari. So this thing can move with, speed of light, but it's not necessarily that strong. It's not the perfect machinery for pulling a house, not even a little boat. That's not the purpose of a Ferrari. Then we move to stamina, which is your typical endurance. When people talk about someone who's good at endurance, they've got good stamina. Most of us know what we're talking about. Suppleness, that's our flexibility, range of motion. So these four most people pretty much know about. But let's look a little lower. There's another two S's there. The first is skill. And for those that don't think skill is a parameter of fitness, there is a lot to learn there. It is a huge and very important component of fitness, and you'll see why as we go into it. But this includes things like balance, coordination, agility. Some people class agility separately, but I'll go into why I put them together. And finally, size, or more importantly, composition, actually. When it comes to a component of fitness, it's not so physiological, but in certain sporting contexts, size does matter, because or body composition more importantly, because it does affect performance, as you can think of many different sporting types, and the physiques or body compositions that are required for each. So therefore it does become an important factor, particularly in sports. Now let's take all of these to another level. So let's break it down to, like I said, that next level of complexity for the purpose of understanding. Let's look at these parameters of fitness, components. We've still got strength at the top there, and its definition is the extent to which muscles can exert a contractile force. So it's kind of just like brute force. You know what a muscle does? It shortens. That's it. It can't even lengthen by itself. It gets pulled to be lengthened, to stretch. But a muscle just produces a contractile force when it turns on, and when it turns off, as in it relaxes, then it just sits there, and hopefully something else pulls it so it lengthens again, like the opposing muscle. So we know about strength. Power. You notice there's no speed here. What this is if you were to think about taking that truck, which is really strong, taking that Ferrari, which is really fast, high acceleration, and putting them together to produce a machine that can pull a house quickly. That's power. So think of strength times speed, and you've got power. You can't have power without strength. You can't have power without speed or acceleration, more importantly. And it is the ability to exert maximum muscular contraction instantly, kind of like in an explosive burst of movements. So think jumping, think springing, think fast, powerful movements. Cardiovascular endurance. This is what most people think of when we think stamina and things like that. The whole cardiopulmonary system, to start with, cardio being heart, the heart system and the blood vessels, and the pulmonary system being the lungs. And the cardiopulmonary system's ability to deliver blood, and in that blood is oxygen and fuel, like glycogen and nutrients, to the working muscles. That's the first part. So getting the, like the oxygen out of the air and into your lungs, around your body, and to the working muscles. And then there's the muscle's ability to use it. So this is where we come to that term, oxygen utilization. And when people talk fitness, especially from a general perspective, generally what we're talking about is the body's ability to transport and utilize oxygen. That's it. You see that term there, VO2 max, and we're not going to go too much into that tonight. We'll go into a hell of a lot of detail in a future webinar when we do cardiovascular endurance. But VO2 max, that's kind of a measurable characteristic of oxygen utilization. And there are other definitions too, like certain thresholds, aerobic and anaerobic threshold, which will become important later on as far as measuring these things. But just think cardiopulmonary system and the localized muscles level as the ability to utilize oxygen. Flexibility. This is the ability to achieve range of motion. So range of motion, we're talking about joints, as in if you think about a joint, there's like tissue that surrounds the joint called a capsule, and if it's if it hasn't typically gone through large ranges of motion in that person's life, then it typically has a short range of motion. Muscles, of course, tight muscles versus loose muscles, tendons, ligaments, connective tissue or fascia, and even fat. Fat can get in the way, can literally limit a person's range of motion. But from the purpose of component of fitness and performance, I want to relate all of this to performance. Not only does flexibility improve quality of life, because every movement is easier, like ease of movement to improve quality of life. But from a performance perspective, think about this. If a certain motion, think of any motion like, say, flexion versus extension. So, like a joint going through flexion or a joint going through extension. Or think about twisting, twisting left or twisting right. Any movement that you do typically has an opposing movement. And if you were to think, if those muscles that want to produce a motion, let's say you're sitting in a chair and your upper torso wants to rotate to the left. Well, the muscles that cause you to rotate to your left require the muscles that rotate you to the right to turn off, because if those muscles turn on, you're going to be stuck. However, if those muscles are tight, even if they turn off, the muscles turning you to the left are already pulling under a resistance, and it's pulling under the resistance of your own body. So imagine every movement, whether you're running and it's your legs extending and contracting, extending, flexing, or your arms, or you're swimming, or you're cycling, or you're just lifting weights or playing a sport, and every movement you do is restricted by your own body's resistance, as in the muscles that are tight and the tendons and ligaments and those joint capsules are tight. Your performance output is so much greater if the range of motion is more fluent, as in less restricted. So flexibility becomes a very important parameter to fitness. That takes us to local muscle endurance. So we didn't see this on the last one. This is quite important from a point of specificity. So when you think about a specific movement or a specific sport, or a specific mode, like say specifically running or specifically riding or specifically doing certain weights movements, for instance. It is a single muscle's ability to perform sustained work. So if you were to think someone who's really good at cycling, for instance, and their muscles are so geared towards cycling just because those specific muscles that work constantly do it over and over and over again, they're constantly performing sustained work, so they get really good at it. They improve the parameters of fitness that are pertinent to cycling. And that person might be really fit from, let's say, for instance, a cardiovascular endurance perspective. And they've also got fantastic local muscle endurance because those legs, those thigh muscles are so good at cycling. But then if that person went to try run, if they've never done running before, while the cardiovascular endurance will help, as in be a direct crossover, because cardiovascular endurance is not specific to anything, but local muscle endurance is. So even though running still uses your legs, as riding does, it uses them in a slightly different way, and it's different enough to be for that person to struggle if they're really good at cycling, but they're not good at running. Vice versa, someone who's really good at running might be able to go forever. They jump on a bike, and it's just odd to them. They don't have the local muscle endurance. So this has to come down to specificity. Agility. Agility kind of involves a couple of factors, one being power and one being skill, as well as a few others, but I think those two are the most important, and I'll go through why I think they're the most important. It is the ability to perform a series of explosive power movements, so there's your power, in rapid succession, so it has to be quickly, and in opposing directions. So if it were just straight, like someone accelerating off the mark, that's wicked power. But it's not necessarily agility. Agility is more pertinent to specific contexts like sports and athletics, where someone has to change direction. Think zigzag running, or think chasing after a ball like a football or something like that, and the ball bounces at the last split second. It goes a completely different way, and the athlete has to push off the ground in one split second movement to follow that ball, almost at a 90-degree angle. That takes huge amounts of power, but also coordination. The more coordinated someone is, the better movement they'll execute. And that's where the skill comes in. So think fast change of direction sprints. Then we come to balance. And again, a lot of people think balance, that's not a component of fitness. And it definitely is. The body's ability to control its own position relative to gravity. That's important. I say gravity because that's just the most common context in sport, but even things like swimming, there's a lot of balance involved, as in to hold the body's posture in the water so that it's streamlined, because if we don't hold that balance, then it becomes less and less efficient. There's drag and there's inefficiency through the water. So balance from the point of, say, weights training, for instance. Well, if you're sitting in a machine and it's pin-loaded machine and you're sitting up against a backrest, well then balance ain't going to be that much of a factor, and it's not even going to help you that much. But we commonly use mostly free weights and the weights exercises where balance is a factor, because if you don't balance the weight, it'll land on your head. Free weights, and it's open to any movement towards gravity, and therefore you have to balance the weight, not to mention balance your own body. And that's where higher centers of the movement cortex of the brain, the part of the back of the brain, particularly the cerebellum, where it coordinates movement, and that's where you get a lot of not just health benefits from that, but also these performance benefits from just being more coordinated from a balance perspective. Finally, there's skill and coordination, and it's kind of like wrapping everything together. The body's ability to integrate the above listed components so that effective movements are achieved. And when we say effective movements, think efficiency. Remember I said the amount of output that you have, so the amount of energy that the body demands, so think demand, that has to do with how good you are at something. So think of two people. The first person is a very avid runner, so someone who's been running for years. They're very efficient at running. And person two is just as fit. They've got the same VO2, cardiovascular endurance. Let's pretend they've got the same local muscle endurance, but they've been playing a completely different sport all their life, and they've never really done running. So person A is really good at running. Person B has the same fitness, but isn't so good at running, has never really done it before, and they both go for a 2-kilometre run, for instance. Person A will run that 2-kilometre run effortlessly, efficiently, almost like gliding along the ground, because they're so trained, so well trained at consistently, the movement patterns, the way the nerves and muscles fire in coordination, in sync, synchronized movements. So it's effortless, and therefore the energy demand is very low. The body doesn't demand much energy. Whereas person B runs 2 kilometres, and not only are they, they're trying and limbs flailing here and there, struggling along this 2-kilometre run, they're losing speed, they're losing energy to all of the inefficient movement patterns that just haven't gotten coordinated yet. Not only do they take longer to run the 2 kilometres because they're slower, so that means one, they're out on the road longer, and for each of those longer minutes they're burning more calories because they're losing energy here and there. The upper body flailing around because they haven't got their posture, or their hips, not having the stability because they're just not used to it. So that's where efficiency becomes such an important factor in performance. Let's now look at each of these in slight more detail. When it comes to power, strength and skill, I've grouped these together because later on we're going to do a webinar on each one of these individually and go right into detail. Tonight I just want to group them together and kind of touch on the main stimulants for each. How do we work on each, just so you've got a rough idea, because we're just doing basic training guidelines tonight. And that way you can literally just tune into the one that you want to hear the most. So you might say, look, I'm really interested in power, for instance, so tune into that webinar. Someone might say, no, I'm really interested in cardiovascular endurance, so tune into that one and we'll go right into depth. But the reason I put strength, power and skill together here is because when it comes to the adaptations, or how to improve them, most of it is neural. That means the nerves have most at play. So if you were to think a nerve is kind of like, when you switch on a light, it is the wire that goes to the light globe, and through that wire is an electric current, and once it hits the globe turns on bright. Well, a muscle is kind of like the light globe, and it could be the brightest, the highest wattage globe in the world, but if there's no electric current telling it to turn on, it doesn't turn on. Same as a muscle. If there's a nerve going to that muscle and there's no electric current, what we call an action potential. If there's no current going through that nerve to the muscle just doesn't turn on. So the way a muscle gets stronger and powerful and more skilled is by the coordination of those nerve firings. So one nerve typically services many muscle fibers, and there's many, many, many nerves. So think of many nerves servicing many, many, many muscle fibers. Firstly, we improve what's called the firing rate. So unlike the wire turning on the light globe, a nerve turning on a muscle doesn't just go on and stay on. It has a firing rate like bang, 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 and it fires at a certain rate. And the more you practice a certain movement and the better you get at it, the stronger you get, the faster that firing rate is. So instead of bang, 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 it literally improves it. So bang, 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 bang. And the harder, the faster the frequency of that firing rate, the more force output we have. Then there's synchronization and excitation of nerves. So synchronization is, imagine all those nerves turning on all those muscle fibers. It's kind of like saying if there's 10 men pulling on a rope, trying to pull a tree over, 10 men, but they're all pulling at different times, then the force output's quite low. But if they can all pull at the same time, someone says, ready, set, go, and they all pull at the same time, then the force output's obviously a lot higher. That's what we mean by synchronization of nerves. And as you practice strength and power and skill movements, that's how it gets better. That's the physiological adaptation that improves the most. You notice it also says, as well as increased inhibition of antagonists. So remember I said before, each action or even each movement kind of has an opposing movement, like, flexion and extension, or external rotation, internal rotation. Think about your arm. Think about a bicep curl, like your biceps being the muscle that moves the weight, and therefore the triceps have to switch off what we call inhibition. Otherwise, if they switched on, then you wouldn't be able to lift it, because the triceps are trying to extend your lower arm while the biceps are trying to flex it, and it just wouldn't work. So what we know is that as we practice strength training, the antagonist muscle, the ones that needs to switch off, needs to inhibit, it gets better at inhibition. That sounds confusing, because it sounds like, well, why don't they just turn off and stay off? But the muscle actually never totally switches off. So even though I'm doing a bicep curl, there's still always a little bit of tension in the triceps, because, there just has to be, that's what they call a tonus. But the more I practice it and the better I get, the more inhibition there will be in the antagonist muscle, and therefore the total force output is higher. Strength, power output is higher. So the main stimulus, when we say, okay, great, we want to improve these things, the main stimulus to improve them is quality. Quality, that means you don't need many reps. In fact, high reps will be counterproductive. Low reps are best. You do need high load, so you can't get top-end strength gains using tiny little weights. It has to be high load. We do want high speed of contraction. So a lot of people think that speed, fast movements means that it's not controlled or precise, but it says there, control and precision with intensity. You can be fast and controlled. I guess that's where the skill comes in, but it is important. So, for instance, take bench press. If I load that bar up, the aim is to move that weight as hard and as fast as you possibly can to excite as many muscle fibers as you can. Remember, turn all those nerves on. If I try to move the weight fast and it does move very fast, well, then the weight's just too light. So I put more weight on and use the resistance to slow down the speed. So then I'm trying to move it as hard and as fast as I possibly can with controlled, precise movements, and the bar just moves smoothly, and that's a really good rep and a good stimulus for power and strength and skill. When it comes to aerobic side of things, so cardiovascular endurance, that whole VO2 max we spoke about, that all comes down to oxygen utilization. As I mentioned before, the body's ability to transport and utilize oxygen. So the main stimulus here is duration and frequency. Duration and you notice it's not got to do with specificity. It doesn't really matter what you do, so long as you're getting into slight levels of breathlessness. You see that word hypoxia? Just hypo means under, just under just not enough oxygen. just short of oxygen, like your body is trying to get the oxygen, or what they call oxygen debt. And so long as you stay in that for duration and do it often, frequently, you get good at cardiovascular endurance. It doesn't matter what you do. It could be running one day, weights, then light weights, high reps sort of thing the next day. Could be swimming. Could be some kind of cross-country, cross-training modalities. Doesn't matter so long as we hit those targets. Then let's go to these three. Local muscle endurance. Now, this is where it comes to specificity. So take running, for instance. To get good at running, you've got to do running. And while there are other exercises that will complement it, and that in fact you should do, like strength training for the legs, for the strength in the legs to support you and decrease wear and tear and things like that, and other variety-based things to improve your running, nothing will actually beat running for running because of the specificity needed in local muscle endurance. There is strength required in local muscle endurance, or strength benefits, I should say. If you're strong, you'll have better local muscle endurance, and also that whole local oxygen utilization. So at the level of the muscle, how good is the muscle at uptaking oxygen and utilizing it? And how that happens, we won't go into now, but just know that it needs to happen. And that comes from practicing specifically the movement or the exercise that you want to get good at. There is a skill and efficiency component. Remember, the more you do something, the more efficient you get, therefore the less demand on energy, and the less demand, the less local muscle endurance you need. So that's good for performance. And the main stimulation is specificity and frequency. So again, do it specifically and do it often. Size and composition. I won't go into too much, but when it comes to size and competition, there's only really two things we're talking about. That's muscle gain and fat loss, because nothing else changes. You don't really change the size of your skeleton, for instance, and visceral organs don't change that much. The only things that really change are muscle and fat. And we say muscle gain is typically there aren't a lot of people that want to lose muscle and gain fat. So, for the most part, it's muscle gain. And with muscle gain, we're talking volume. Volume in a workout. So every workout should be high volume. Volume means the total workload, the sets, the reps, the weight, and also time under tension. So if you were to look at a whole workout, the total volume should be high. Lots of sets, lots of reps, and lots of weight. So it's kind of like, total volume should be high. This also needs to be mixed with recovery and frequency. So what that means is, with volume and muscle gain, we also want it to be frequent, but that kind of depends on recovery, because for the stimulation for a muscle to grow, the stimulation is good if there is high volume with lots of frequency. The stimulation is really good, but the environment isn't necessarily good if it's too frequent, because while hitting the muscle and fatiguing it is the stimulus for it to grow, the actual fertile soil for it to grow, if you will, is while it's resting. So if you're constantly working out that muscle, it's not getting time to rest, so it's not getting time to grow. So you've really got to mix in the frequency with recovery. Enough frequency to stimulate the muscle to grow, yet enough recovery and rest and recuperation periods for it to be allowed to grow. With fat loss, that comes down to more so the whole energy deficit thing, so we won't go too much into that tonight. That's more our nutrition seminars. Flexibility. With flexibility, we're talking about sarcomere lengthening. Imagine a muscle fibre being a long string or strand of fibre, and cross-sectionally are these tiny units called sarcomeres that run all the way along the muscle fibre. And basically there is a resetting of these sarcomeres. So they kind of have a set length, and all they do is contract. That's how the whole muscle contracts. But you see where it says resetting muscle spindles. Muscle spindles are kind of like sensory organs, sensory units inside a muscle that measures two things along with GTOs. They're called Golgi tendon organs. But just think of them as being sensors that measure two things, tension and length. So a muscle has a kind of set tension or a set length where, the feeling when you stretch your hamstring, for instance, and you get to a certain point and it starts talking back at you. Oh, that's it. That's long enough. That's about all I'm comfortable with. And it'll start talking back to you and you start feeling the pinch. Well, that's where that's not the length of the muscle. That is not the maximum length of the muscle. That's just the length that the muscle is comfortable going before it says, hey, I'm not comfortable going any further because I'm not used to going any further. So what happens is once these sensory units start saying, hey, I'm at, my comfort level here, I'm nearing outside my comfort level, then what happens is it starts telling the muscle to contract to protect itself. So once it gets too long, it'll then say, nah, start tightening up, start shortening just to protect itself. So when we aim for flexibility, what we want is frequency and duration of those sarcomeres and connective tissues being in the lengthened position. So it doesn't have to be an intense stretch, it just has to be in a lengthened position. So in fact, if you were to do a stretch, pick a stretch, whatever, for instance, and hold it at a really intense stretch level, like, just a 9 out of 10 stretch, and only hold it for, like 20 seconds or something like that, that's not going to help you with flexibility. In fact, it could be counterproductive because the muscles are probably going to shorten just to protect themselves. Say, whoa, this is too intense. My preference is I would rather do a 7 out of 10 stretch, but just sit there for a longer period of time and just let those muscle spindles and Golgi tendons, those sensory units, let them literally reset. So it says, this is long enough, that's it, there's too much tension in the muscle for my liking. But you hold it there for a while and it says, okay, I'm starting to get used to this. And it lets off a bit and it resets to a new length, and then you stretch it to a new length and it says, all right, but I'm definitely not comfortable with that, and you leave it there for long enough and it resets and you can slowly go further and further. So with flexibility, frequency and duration again. Now, when it comes to performance, think of two sides of the equation. I say performance because when people talk about results, they can just talk about the cosmetic side of things, which is fantastic. That's your whole, losing fat, getting the six-pack abs, putting on muscle, looking good and whatnot. And that's all fantastic. The other side of it is specifically to do with performance, like in the context of an athlete or sports. Sometimes they don't care what you look like so long as you can perform your duty. And that's when it comes to performance. And that comes down to two things. One is increased supply. So supply, we're talking about those physiological components that we spoke about before, and increasing the capacity of those. So for instance, if it comes to oxygen utilization, for instance, increasing the body's capacity to utilize oxygen. If it comes to the neural adaptations, well, increasing the body's capacity to, do the firing rate and the synchronization, or increasing the body's capacity for local muscle endurance. And that's more provision side of things. And it comes down to physiological capacity. On the other side of it, we want decreased demand. Remember I gave the example of the two runners, and the one that's a more avid runner has less demand on energy because they're efficient. And that's generally neurological. Nerves, more a skill-based thing. Yes, muscles as well, but more the nerves. So when we think about neurological efficiency, if someone's doing the Olympics are coming up, right? So we're going to be seeing the Olympic lifts. Those Chinese women taking on the Russian men almost. And where they do the clean and jerk and the snatch, a very, very highly skilled movement. Not only do they need huge amounts of power and strength, but they do need huge amounts of skill because there's such an amount of balance and precision involved in those movements. So neurological efficiency to them is so important. Otherwise, they lose a little bit of force or strength here and there, and they've missed the weight. So if we can improve supply and decrease demand, our performance output is immensely increased. I'll quickly finish up with a story. There was an ancient athlete of the Greek Olympics, the ancient Olympics, named Milo of Crotona. And Milo of Crotona was famed for his glorious feats of strength. He was meant to be a really strong guy, and for his accolades in the wrestling arena. He was a wrestler. And while he was born in Italy, he grew up, lived and trained in Greece for the Greek Olympics. And what was interesting about Milo of Crotona is they say that for one of the Olympics he trained by picking up a baby calf and walking with it for distance. And the very next day he did the same thing. He picked up the same baby calf and walked with it for distance. And he did this every day leading up to the Olympics. Now, the Olympics are 4 years apart. So they say that Milo of Crotona walked into the Olympic Stadium, this big, powerfully built physical man with a full-grown heifer upon his shoulders. Now, what I like about this story is that it perfectly depicts the principle of progressive overload. And progressive overload is where we introduce the body to a demand that's greater than what is accustomed to handling, but it has to be gradual. That's why it's called the principle of progressive overload, to gradually introduce the body to a greater demand. And it's kind of like setting small goals of incremental increases in any one of those parameters, right? So you might say, okay, I want to improve cardiovascular endurance. So we say, great, what were the main stimulants for cardiovascular endurance? How can I gradually, slowly tweak over time incremental increases so I use the principle of overload to that parameter? Or you might say strength. Great, what's the strength parameter? I want to improve strength. What are the parameters or the stimulants for strength? Great, remember we said we want quality, the whole low reps, high load. Let's gradually tweak that over time. Now, I want to wrap it up there, guys, for our basic training guidelines. And we would love to hear your feedback and your questions. You can send them here. Send your questions to info@conanfitness.com. And we can answer them either there and then, or we'll put them in our blog. So we'll blog the answers so that everyone else can benefit from your question. And like I said, we're going to wrap it up for tonight, basic training guidelines, but look out for next month's Conan Fitness Platinum webinar, and we look forward to hearing your questions. Thanks.